All right, well, welcome everyone to this webinar on the art of neighboring during the COVID-19 crisis. Honored to have Dave Runyon here, the author of The Art of Neighboring. Many of the pastors that are on, I'm sure, are familiar with this resource, but wanted to talk to him about how to do this well, given the complications as we enter kind of this next phase of the pandemic. So Dave, thanks so much for taking some time out of your schedule to be with us today.
Yeah, you bet, Josh.
So a few weeks ago, we were on a call with Senator Todd Young here in the state of Indiana. And towards the end of the call, we asked him, what are some ways that churches can help? And I was surprised by his answer, and that he talked a lot about some things that I had expected. But then he mentioned the issue of loneliness. And I think we were facing a loneliness epidemic prior to the COVID-19 crisis, the breakdown of the family, et cetera. But this has made it that much worse. And so I was interested that he said that, and it sparked the idea for, well, let's talk about how can churches solve this problem? And as many of those that are on the call would be church leaders, it's not just, well, you can't go out and solve this entirely yourself. It's how do you mobilize your church to do it as well? And I thought there's no better resource than The Art of Neighboring. And so I want to just give you kind of a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. Of course, here's our topic. The Daniel Initiative here in the state of Indiana, we're busy connecting the ministers of God, the ministers of government. We want to partner with them. We want to minister to them, but then we want to partner with them in solving tough problems. If you're familiar with this, I'm sure if you're in the state of Indiana, you've seen the Back on Track plan. And so we're truly entering that next phase as things begin to open up. And that's what I really wanted to dig into today. We've had a couple of weeks to think about how do we connect with people during a complete shutdown? But now as we start to reopen, I think people are going to be paranoid. How do we neighbor well during that? I did want to focus on one particular project that we're working on. We call it the Do Good Project. And as this started, we work to connect Indiana churches to community needs. And so if you haven't been on Do Good Indiana and you're in the state of Indiana, I encourage you to take a look at that. And we identified kind of 6 areas where churches could help: food banks, blood drives, local schools, providing space, providing supplies for the vulnerable, and then assisting the unemployed. And so that's going to go right along what we're talking about here today. And then here's just a basic preview of what we're going to talk about. Again, the next phase of the pandemic, I described that a bit. We're about to jump into the art of neighboring and the COVID-19 crisis, and then we'll have a brief Q&A time. David does have to jump off right at the 12:40 mark, and so we'll end probably about 12:30-ish, and then we'll switch over to Q&A, and would love to get ideas from those that are participating as well. So David, as I jump into this, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself, but then also what sparked The Art of Neighboring, the book, the movement, and tell us a little bit about what you've done there in Colorado, and then how that's impacted churches around the country.
Yeah, you bet. Well, similar, before I get into kind of the backstory, similar to what you experienced with your senator, a few weeks ago, we had an interesting interaction with our one of our epidemiologists at the state health department. And she was talking about what she was seeing from all these churches. And a lot of the churches were starting new programs and trying to respond and doing all the things that we as church leaders try to do in these moments. But she said this, and it really gave a lot of clarity to what we're going to talk about today. But she said, right now, we don't need churches to create a bunch of new programs. What we need is for the people who attend those churches to simply be good neighbors and to do it in a careful and thoughtful manner. And when she said that, it just aligned with a lot of the work that we've been doing here over the last 10 years. And it was just this reminder of that relationships always trump programs. And that's a lot of what we've discovered through the art of neighboring, is that when people are connected based on proximity, it takes off a lot of the weight that government leaders are trying to carry, and these programs that they're trying to create for people in need. And so you're right, there's a loneliness epidemic going on right now, a social isolation epidemic happening right now. People aren't seeing each other at work. They're not seeing each other at church or at school. But we're noticing people are out in the neighborhood all over the place. And, they're more visible now than ever. And so I think we have a great opportunity right now to, take this idea of loving your neighbor literally and seriously, and to have a huge impact in what's happening right now in our world. And so this neighboring journey started for me about 12 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. I was starting to help faith leaders come together and to think about our city. I'm here in a little suburb of about 120,000 people right outside of Denver. And as faith leaders, we were sitting in a room with our mayor asking these questions about, what could we do together that we could never do alone? What's the smartest thing that we could do? Where do you feel stuck? And our mayor said, if you wanted to have the biggest impact on our city, you should start a neighboring movement. And he just said it in passing. But we were like, wait a minute, he didn't understand the irony that he was telling a bunch of pastors to do the Bible. And so we had to slow him down and say, hey, talk more about that. What do you mean? What do you mean by a neighboring movement? And why does that matter to you as a city leader? And he just started to share with us some of his heart around this. What we learned is our assistant city manager, a woman named Vicky, was the neighboring guru. And so she came in and just started to talk about the fact that when people know their actual neighbors, the crime rates drop. When there's a crisis, an emergency, your neighbors are often your first responders. She talked to us out of Malcolm Gladwell's book that people live significantly longer when they know their actual neighbors. So we're listening to all this pragmatic, practical stuff. And we're also sitting there thinking, yeah, and the Bible, like the central teaching of the Bible says to do this. And so that started us on a journey with our city leaders to begin to dream and to think about how could we start a literal neighboring movement? How could we challenge the people that show up in our congregations to really engage and to take this idea of loving your neighbor literally and seriously? And we started with really low bar stuff. It was like, hey, you should probably know the names of your neighbor, and like they should probably be important enough to you to remember their names. And so we started we use this little tic-tac-toe board thing that you can find on our website, but it's a little block map. And it's just a tool that helps people learn and retain and use the names of their neighbors. And that was a journey for me as well, of going back and realizing, man, there's people that live around me that I've met 3 and 4 times, that I've lived next to for multiple years. And yet I didn't know their name. I didn't remember their name. And so I started going and having a series of mildly awkward conversations with my neighbors of just saying, hey, this is embarrassing. I forgot your name. And then I just started to write them down. And then I started to use their names when I saw them. And then we started to throw block parties, and we just started to become friends with some of the people that we live around. And so that's been a real gift, and on a number of levels. And we've just been following the breadcrumbs ever since.
You mentioned something in a video that really stuck out to me, and that is, if you look at the average American kind of middle class family, and perhaps in any social strata in our society, we're marked by garage doors. We kind of drive in at night, garage door closes, we have privacy fences. And look, this is convicting to me as well. But would you dive into that just a little bit? I mean, that seems to be the way our culture has developed. We prize the nuclear family in the sense that it's like, us 6 or maybe 8, however many you may have in your family, but that's kind of your entire world. That's certainly different than the way that people have lived throughout much of history, and certainly is different than the New Testament vision of community in the church. Would you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think that the value of literal neighboring is low right now. But when people think back, and they'll talk, most people will talk about a time where they knew their literal neighbors and when they were engaged with them. And it's been interesting to kind of think about what are some of the factors that have led us to the point that we're at now. Certainly technology has been a big part of that. When people used to leave work, they actually left work. And now when people leave work, they carry around this little computer in their pocket that attaches them to their work. And so people tend to have less margin to be out in their front yards. We're more transient than we used to be. And so people are traveling all over the place. And so we've kind of lost a theology of place in some regards on that level. I think the news cycle, the constant, 24-hour news cycle, when you're exposed to the worst stories of what's happening in humanity all across the world nonstop. It does something to us where we start to kind of make assumptions about other people that we might not have made otherwise. And so I think those two issues of time and of fear have kind of are big obstacles in connecting with our literal neighbors. Certainly, even the architecture, the way that houses are built right now, they're not built towards the front patio, they're built towards the backyard. And so we just see people less than we have in the past. And we are living in a way in which we're not present in our own neighborhoods as much as we were. And so I think all of that has kind of combined. Now, there are some great things that are happening. The move back into the cities, into kind of more densely populated areas that's happening. It's a good sign that people are saying, you know what, I'm willing to put up with a few other things in order to be close to where I live and I work and I hang out. And so I have some hope that the pendulum's starting to swing back, and that there's kind of a rediscovering of the art of neighboring that's happening. And it's been a lot of fun to be part of that and to kind of watch that happen.
And so last question before we jump into some of the nuts and bolts of this. I know that your work has been, it's been shown in Christianity Today, Denver Post, a lot of other major publications, as well as praised by pastors like Menlo Park Presbyterian, John Ortberg, if those that are listening are familiar with him. I'm just saying that this really mobilized their church. So would you talk a little bit about the impact the Art of Neighboring has had since, I think, 2012 when it was first published? And then also talk a little bit about what you're doing with the governor of the state of Colorado right now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, my buddy and I, Jay, we wrote this book thinking this will be a cute little thing for our moms to put on a bookshelf and to tell people that their son wrote a book. And so we had no idea what we were falling into. I think what we've learned is that it scaled really quickly because it was simple, and it was very concrete, and we created a little mini crisis for people. So I think most people change in crisis, and the crisis for me was hearing our mayor and our city leaders talk about the value of literal neighboring, and then realizing as a pastor that I wasn't very engaged in my own neighborhood. And when I had to sit and look at this little tic-tac-toe board that represented the 8 closest neighbors to me, and I had to realize that I only could fill out the names of 2, both names of the adults in 2 of those boxes, it made me realize, hey, in order to love your neighbor, it might be important to know their first name. And I don't even know these people's names. And so just that, this, and we shared that with our people and created a crisis for a lot of our people. They realized they had chosen how they wanted to do the love the neighbor thing, and that they had made it very big and broad, which it is included in Jesus's economy, but they had, they'd forgotten that maybe their actual neighbors, that maybe Jesus meant them too. And so for me, that little simple idea of just starting with learning people's names and then taking the next small step is what was also attractive to other congregations. I think there's about 3,200 churches now in the country that have taken this simple idea and they've preached on this idea of, literal neighboring. And so places, and people, leaders that we never expected to grab onto this thing, really smart people who are brilliant and who have these incredible sermons every week, ended up grabbing onto a lot of our stuff, even though it was really simple, but because it was concrete, and using it as a tool to help their people begin to engage with their actual neighbors. And so it's been a lot of fun to watch that happen, and to watch it evolve over, the last 8-9 years. The scale has been way beyond anything that we'd thought of. So, and then, the stuff that's happening with our governor's office, I think we have just a unique bridge of communication from a lot of the faith leaders around our state. And so our governor, when the COVID stuff landed, just reached out and said, hey, can we start putting together a line of communication to faith leaders around the state? And so we've been doing these bi-weekly phone calls with our governor, and he just hops on, gives an update, talks about what, as much as he can, about what he's hoping that for the faith leaders and for the faith communities going forward. And then we do some Q&A. And so we're just doing these little 30-minute touch points that I think have been really valuable of connecting congregations to our state government office. And it's also just given us a space to have some mutual grace. I think that's one of the things I've learned, Josh,
Yeah.
about faith and government leaders have a lot in common. There's usually a calling for both that have gotten, neither one are usually doing what they're doing just for a paycheck. There's some kind of a calling that has happened. Both are trying to serve communities and groups of people that have a lot of opinions about how they should lead. And so I think there's some common
I'm
ground
sure the
there.
church leaders are like, no, that's not my church at all.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And both have a heart to serve vulnerable populations. And I think that's where I've been really encouraged. You can have differing opinions with your government leaders. Certainly, Daniel did. I love the Daniel Project. Certainly, Joseph. I think Pharaoh and Joseph had some differing opinions on on values, but God can still use relationships with government leaders and with faith leaders to do amazing things. And so I've just tried to look for opportunities to partner with our government leaders, no matter who they are, around God's heart for the vulnerable, and their heart, the state's heart, the city's hearts for taking care of the poor and the vulnerable as well. And it's been a lot of fun to do that.
That's amazing. And just as I'm thinking about the Daniel Initiative, we're connecting ministers of God, ministers of government. It's just a beautiful example of where this can go. We're about a year into the project here in Indiana. We're already seeing some of the fruit from those relationships, but it's just a powerful testimony of what you've been able to do there in Colorado. Well, let's pivot now and jump into, we're now transitioning. A lot of states are opening back up slowly.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we neighbor well as we hit this next phase of the pandemic? And part of this may simply be coming back to the nuts and bolts of the art of neighboring, and just saying, look, this is an incredible opportunity to do this. If you've never done it before, do it now. But what are some just practical ideas that you could share with church leaders about neighboring during the crisis?
Yeah, and I think as we enter into this new season, I think it's going to be really important for us to understand the chronic anxiety that exists for a lot of people is real. And so there's been so much fear and caution, well-deserved caution around some of these things. And I think for us, even as we start to, some of these churches may start to open back up, we continue to engage with our neighbors. We just need to understand people are in very different places on this, and to be very respectful and to be very understanding. And I think as we continue to engage with our neighbors, doing a lot of the stuff that we've been doing during this COVID period is really important. In my neighborhood, we've been doing just sit-ins where everybody brings their own lawn chair, brings their own drink. We hang out, couples are hanging out 10 feet apart from each other. We're just hanging out for an hour and just talking and chatting. I'm an extrovert, so this whole quarantine thing has been a nightmare for me. But that's been life-giving in a number of ways. Reaching out to the neighbors and just finding out, are there people that are older that might not want to go out as much? Are there some things, if you're healthy and that you want to be very careful about what you do, that you might be able to serve them? Collecting information and just making sure your neighbors are connected with each other is a really big deal during this time. It's a great window for everybody says, oh yeah, I wish I experienced neighborhoods like I used to when I was younger. Well, this is an amazing time to do that. And so a lot of the stuff that is happening in my world has been virtual, and certainly some of my connections with my neighbors have been virtual during this time. My wife's been doing some Zoom call happy hours with people. There's and I'm stunned at the creative ways that people of faith are reaching out and becoming catalysts inside their neighborhoods during this time. And so I think it's important to continue to lean into this. There's going to be a lot of things that happen during this time, best practices that churches picked up that are going to get thrown to the side as things go back to normal. And I think that's going to be a real missed opportunity. And there's going to be a lot of things that we hold on to. And so I'm hoping that this idea of literal neighboring and connecting with our actual neighbors is something that we hold on to, and that this is a springboard to a lot of believers experiencing the kind of neighborhoods that they say that they want to experience.
You've produced a great resource called The Art of Neighboring COVID-19 Neighboring Toolkit. I'm going to go ahead and share that here. Thought maybe it'd be helpful to just kind of walk through this, and here's some introductory info, but then kind of these first and next steps. I love that, reaching out to your neighbor via email or phone, making a point to talk to them, and all those that are on the call, we'll email this out. This has been made publicly available. Ask how they're doing, build a neighborhood directory. You've talked a little bit about this. There was a pastor, a friend of mine, that I think they had a neighborhood concert where everybody was socially distanced. The guy was in his garage, and they just had the whole neighborhood, kind of the cul-de-sac, come out. So would you dive into a couple of these, and how could pastors, and one of the reasons I love this, and I think why 3,200 churches have jumped onto it, is it's not, hey, pastor, you've got to schedule another program. This is mobilizing your people and your church to impact their neighborhood. And then if everybody in our church is impacting their neighborhood, what does that do for reaching our entire community for the cause of Christ? So if I'll continue scrolling here through these a little bit, but if you want to talk a little bit about these options.
Sure. I'll go. The best thing that I'm seeing happen is people using this as an opportunity to engage with others about things of depth. I mean, there's never been an easier time to just see that neighbor who's out walking, who you know their name, but you hardly ever talk to them, but just to say, hey, to linger a little bit and say, hey, like, what has this meant for your work? That's like a simple question, but it gets below the surface of where a lot of people normally engage. Or to say, hey, how's this going with your kids? And how's the at-home learning happening for you? Or do you have any parents that you're concerned about? Or is there anybody else in your life? And so, like, these little things are what makes a big difference. It makes an enormous difference when you remember your neighbors' names and use them when you see them. And connecting that for the people that you lead, so that they know it's a spiritual issue. Like, to be able to tell people, hey, like, what you do in your front yard counts. It's real ministry. It's just like serving on the elder board or volunteering at church with the kids. Those are really important things that I think can lead to real relationships. And a lot of times we just wave and pass people by. And so I think that's one of the best things we can do at this time, is just simply like have enough margin in our life to connect with people and to ask how they're doing. Right now, it's just the soil's ripe to be able to learn about the people that you live right around. And so there's a lot of other stuff in there, just taking a walk with neighbors at a distance. I mentioned some of the stuff that we're doing in our neighborhood around sit-ins. I would just say this about caring for older at-risk neighbors. Go the extra mile, but just put them at ease, especially ones that may not have family around, to just be constantly reaching out and saying, hey, is there anything that you need? How are you doing? Even if they don't take you up on help, just them having somebody to talk to and to engage with and to know that they're a phone call away is a huge, huge deal right now. And so I would just reiterate that, like, just because they don't say, yeah, I need help, doesn't mean it's not worth continuing just to touch base with them. I would just encourage you in that to think about some of those things. And it's just the little things, I think, that make a big difference, Josh.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that point of Alan Sutherland from Shepherd Community Center's on, and Jay Height, they're from the Community Center, has shared with me multiple times how some of what they call their neighbors there in the neighborhood community that they serve, sometimes these individuals will go weeks, if not months, without human interaction, which just blows my mind. But it happens all the time. And so what a great opportunity to go up to somebody and try to start that.
Yeah, for sure.
So these are some resources that others have seen, including some notes and emails, which are helpful. But I wanted to come down to the bottom as we kind of wrap up the presentation time and shift the Q&A. But you were talking about the very simple kind of tic-tac board about who's my neighbor. And this, I believe, is what you're talking about. So would you share kind of how this can be used?
Yeah, so this is the key to everything that happened in our city. This is actually the whole book right here. I'm just going to give it, I'm going to save you the time from reading the book or having to buy it. So this little block map was was everything. And all we did was this. We did this as faith leaders, and then we did this with all the people in our churches. We just simply said, all right, we're going to take a test. And I want you to imagine that you walk out the front door of your ranch, your apartment, your home, whatever it is, and just think about the 8 most logical neighbors to you. So if you walk out the front door, what are the 8 closest neighbors? And then we just asked people, okay, would you write down the names of those people, the people that live in those houses? And man, when I first did this, as I mentioned, it was a crisis. And when we do this with people, I mean, there's about 10% of believers that can write down all the names of the people in those 8. And most people, well over 50% of people, cannot write down the names of the people, all the names of the people in 4 or more of those homes. And that for us was the key of going, okay, so now we know where to start. This idea of like taking, the great commandment, the love your neighbor thing, literally, now we have a starting place. We have a concrete starting place. And so we didn't ask people when we started in this thing, we didn't say, hey, would you, let's love your neighbor. We just said, hey, would you make a commitment to learn and retain your neighbor's names and to use their names when you see them? And that little simple thought and setting the bar really low, I think paid off really big for us. And so this little thing, you can print this out and put it on your fridge. We've got these things as refrigerator magnets if people choose to use them. But this tool was everything for us, Josh. And it was really kind of the secret sauce for getting momentum in our community. And then you have to talk about it often. It takes a lot of courage as a pastor right now to talk about the same simple thing over and over again. But that's how you build culture, and that's how you build DNA. And so that's what I would just encourage people to do, is to talk about the same thing over and over again, and to build it into a value and bake it into the DNA of your congregation instead of just making it into a sermon. But that little block map at the end of that is the key to doing that.
And I just mentioned on your website, you do have magnets that you can purchase for very low cost. So if a church wants to go deeper with this and wants to encourage their members, I believe you have a Bible study as well that you can do for small groups or Sunday school.
There's a bunch of free resources on orderofneighboring.com. I think what I would recommend for churches and for pastors is there's a cheat sheet. So on our resource page, there's like a cheat sheet for pastors, and it's basically, here's everything we've learned from working with a lot of churches over the last 8 years. And so that's a great starting point. If you're looking for a place to start, go onto our resource page, download that cheat sheet, take a read through that, and see if this makes sense for your congregation.
I mentioned this on a podcast recently, but before this entire shutdown, I was at a large church, 20,000 plus in all their campuses. And the pastor just asked the question, like, how many of you came because of a billboard or even a social media ad? And every time he asked the question, there'd be kind of a smattering of hands. But then he asked, how many of you are here because a friend invited you? And it was pretty much the entire place.
Yeah.
So you think about, building relationships, having gospel conversations, helping people become disciples of Christ. In our distracted world, I think this is ground zero for us. And those that joined us today, I don't know, and this is similar to a lot of the stuff we talk about. I'm not sure anybody walks away from this today thinking, wow, Sherlock, I've never thought about that before. But this just serves as a reminder to all of us that, first of all, we should be doing it primarily in our own lives, but then encouraging our people to do it as well. So Dave, thanks so much for just sharing this today and being willing to kind of go first. And what you mentioned about how the city leaders were able to bring some ideas to help the church be even more strategic in its mission is something that we kind of glance over if we're just always concerned about religious liberty, though that certainly is an issue. But certainly let's not leave those strategic opportunities on the table. And that's what we're trying to do through the Daniel Initiative. So we're going to transition here. We have just a few minutes left. If we don't have questions, we'll go ahead and just wrap up. But at this time, if anybody that's on, if you either have a question or if you'd like to share an example kind of how your church is ministering to your community and some examples of neighboring that you've seen that have just blessed your heart, feel free to kind of reach out and share those. I did mention the Shepherd Community Center, and I've talked to Jay Height several times. One a neat idea that they had was they ended up taking iPad Airs and sanitizing them and then passing them out to elderly individuals in their community so they could do telehealth appointments and not have to leave their homes for those telehealth appointments. But any questions that anyone has before we jump off?
And I'll just say one more. Go ahead. I'll say one more thing. Your thought there about how to connect with government leaders. What we've learned is you can just ask local government leaders. Get as local as you can. City manager, police chief, whatever it is, and you can just ask them, where do you feel stuck? You'll learn a lot about the systemic issues in your community. And so that's been the best practice for us, is create a room where faith leaders can come into the room, meet local government leaders, and then just simply say, where do you feel stuck? Where do you get a lot of phone calls for, and just go, oh man, I don't know what to do with this. And my guess is that in most communities, their answer to that question could lead you to something that the church could really do together and to do in a strategic way.
That's a great example. And one last question, I suppose, would be how did you get connected with the governor? Was it just your influence increased and then somebody took note and they reached out to you?
Yeah, I think I had started doing this with I started doing this with our police chief and with our city manager. And then we started to build those relationships. And over time, that takes a lot of time. And over time, the previous governor had known that I was helping faith and government leaders connect. And it was just one of those small connections. And then when our current governor came and took over, he asked me to continue to do some of this work. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, I think it happens on the front. It happens with a lot of coffees and breakfasts and lunches with leaders, and just kind of hearing their story and then figuring out how can we call the party and begin to think about the whole instead of just our individual institutions.
That's helpful. So I have a question from Chris Kellermeyer. What's been the greatest objection to the neighboring movement? Have there been any pushback or any pieces of pushback that you've received?
Yeah, I mean, people want to choose how they love their neighbors. So, and I think I did this for a lot of my life. So the biggest pushback is people say, well, listen, when Jesus talks about loving your neighbor, he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And the story of the Good Samaritan says that everybody's your neighbor. That's not what the story of the Good Samaritan says. It says when you care for the person in front of you, no matter who it is, no matter where you are, that's an act of loving your neighbor. And so I used the story of the Good Samaritan for a lot of my life to just kind of choose how I wanted to neighbor. And so I worked at a church, and I would do programs at a church, and I would spend time with people there and just kind of go, yeah, everybody's my neighbor, so I'm loving my neighbor all the time. And I lived in a way in which I guess got to a place where I just felt like, well, I'm doing all this other stuff, so then that sprinkles magic fairy dust over my actual neighborhood, and Jesus wasn't talking about them. Now, when you say that out loud, you realize how stupid that is, and you realize the flaw in it. But it's very easy to drift into that moment. And I love what happens in that story. The Good Samaritan is the teacher of the law comes to Jesus and says, hey, what's the greatest commandment? It's love God with everything you have, heart, mind, soul, strength, and love your neighbors yourself. By the way, Jesus gets the guy to answer his own question. So then he affirms him. He goes, oh yeah, that's the textbook answer. You're exactly right. Do this and you will live. And the next little thing that happens in that text is it says, this teacher of the law, it says, but in order to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? His first thought was like, how do I get out of this? Where's the loophole? And he tries to find the loophole by like, neighbor, what does that really mean? He wants to define the word neighbor so that it most easily fits into what he's already up to. I'll tell you what, that's what happened to me. Is I wanted to choose how I wanted to love my neighbor instead of actually thinking that there's something powerful about what's happening right around me. And so that's been really helpful thought for me, and has kind of kept me going down this road.
Thanks. And Chris, who leads a group of about 90 pastors in the Indy area, just mentioned that he is thankful for this, and he recommends your book to all of his pastors. In the Q&A section, we received this comment about just thanks for the outstanding practical insights. Look forward to reading your book. Pastor mentioned that he talks to members all the time who don't know the names of those around them.
Yep.
Mentioned that one thing that his church is doing, this church in Southeast Indiana, one thing we did was working with the local fruit company, bought several fruit baskets and distributed to local hospitals, funeral homes, and others serving the community. So great example there. One idea that I did have, just as I'm talking to pastors, I'm hearing a lot of them say that they have a team that is calling all of the members of their church. And so, I know that you've got to build those relationships with existing members, but especially as we're kind of phasing into the next stage here, maybe encouraging members with this resource to say, you want to serve, you want to make a difference. Here's a really great, just practical way for you to be strategic and intentional about neighboring. And so while you're calling them, saying, okay, well, you now take this call and now go talk to the 8 neighbors that you have. That would be just one example.
Yep. Oh, I love it. Yeah, I love it. Well, Josh, this has been awesome. I really appreciate it. I love what you're doing there in Indiana.
David, last question. If you had a kind of a billboard on which you could put a message to the church, what would you put on it?
What if Jesus meant our actual neighbors too?
Okay. That's it. Yeah.
That's it.
Deeply convicting, very practical. And so, David, just wanted to say thank you for having the courage to, just admit, hey, even a pastor, I wasn't doing this well. Now serving over 3,200 churches around the country. And just thank you for taking some time to share this with us today.
Hey, you bet, Josh. It was fun to hang out with you.
All right. Take care.